This is ShiftLeaf Temple, a puzzle-based platformer level in Geometry Dash that also happens to be made by me. I'm a huge puzzle game fan, and although I went pretty light on the puzzles in this level, I tried to apply everything I know about what makes a good puzzle game, as limited as that might be. If you haven't played the level yet, I definitely recommend playing it before watching this video. It's a lot more fun when you don't already know all the puzzles. But for those who have played it, here's how I made ShiftLeaf Temple. An important aspect of any puzzle is the core mechanic you're working around. In Baba Is You, it's the movable text. In Portal, it's the, well, portals. And in ShiftLeaf Temple, it's the shifting blocks that move whenever you change directions. I made this simple mechanic by detecting when the player clicks left or right, then using advanced follow triggers to move the blocks to invisible objects in the level. Now, a good mechanic is only supplementary to how you introduce it to the player. Because the player has likely never seen this exact mechanic before, it's important to convey to them how it works and what you can do with it before throwing them waist deep into a giant puzzle room. The way I introduce the shifting blocks is by putting one right in the center of the first frame of entering the level. From here, I take full advantage of the classic trope of moving right and up that we see in almost any platformer game, where the block will shift upwards out of view. From there, the path is relatively obvious. Jump over the gap, hit the orb, and jump onto this platform. I made this section of the level have some relatively tight jumps in hopes that the player will slightly adjust to line themselves up, causing the block to move sporadically. This breaks up any assumptions a player might have about the block being on a timer, forcing them to think a little bit harder about how it actually works. I like this method of silent teaching a lot more than just having a small block of text explaining how it works. There is very intentional level design used to teach the player the mechanic, but the player is essentially discovering how it works for themselves, rather than being told. The rest of this room is relatively straightforward, just being an introduction to using the same block multiple times, and the raw difficulty they can expect from the rest of the level. From here, the level gets a bit more serious. The camera zooms out to reveal a bigger room with multiple blocks moving in different directions. It seems confusing at first, but this is still really just an introductory room to teach the player different ways of using this mechanic. First of which is this pit. Previously, the player only ever used the blocks while they were stationary, only switching the direction while they weren't touching it, so this introduces the concept of using the block to move the icon. In retrospect, this pit was a bit of a difficulty jump, but hey, at least it's right after a checkpoint, so you can just keep trying over and over with minimal consequences for dying. The rest of this room focuses a lot more on changing directions mid-air in order to move the blocks. The first room flowed pretty naturally, the block would kinda just be in the right place for the direction you were going. This room, however, is quite the opposite, forcing the player to go right in order to be pushed to the left by this block, for example. This is a very important thing to teach the player, as it's a core element that allows for better puzzle building, as we'll see later on in the level. Something else I want to mention about this room is the exit. Something incredibly important for puzzle levels is to make the exit point clear and visible. You can have the most difficult puzzle imaginable, but if there's a clear exit, there's a motivation for the player to keep going. They can see where they need to get. In the first and second rooms, the exit isn't immediately visible, but the path is very clear until you can see the exit, marked with these green arrows. By design, the second room has you passing right by the exit, giving the player a clear goal but still forcing them to look around the room and work out how to get there. It's clear that in order to get to the exit, you need to flip your gravity, so you look around this room and see this blue orb. If you don't do this, you could see the player just going in circles, not really knowing what to do. A good puzzle hides a solution in plain sight, instead of just hiding the pieces. A puzzle just hiding a key in a hidden compartment, for example, doesn't make the player feel smart for figuring it out. It feels unfair. It's like trying to put together a jigsaw where someone takes a piece. It's just not fun. Anyway, after a few more jumps requiring a mid-air switch, we fall into this corridor with a checkpoint, a dash orb, and a block. This is mechanic teaching at its simplest, giving the player a checkpoint to allow for easy experimentation, and giving them just a couple elements to mess around with until they get it. Being able to switch directions while in a dash orb isn't the most intuitive thing since you're not really changing direction at all. Throwing this into a big puzzle room where the dash orb trick is just a small part in the middle would essentially be the same as hiding a piece of the puzzle. If it's a bit more intuitive, like switching directions mid-air, then it can feel more like thinking outside of the box. But for less intuitive mechanics, it's important to introduce it to the player so that they know the tools required to solve more difficult puzzles later on. After this first dash orb, I put another requiring a precise switch between these two blocks, just to make sure it wasn't a fluke that the player got through the first section and that they really know how the mechanic works. As you go through this door, the camera zooms out to a big open room with a lot of blocks, orbs, and feelings of overwhelmingness. Now, because this this room is very overwhelming when you first enter, I made a tiny first goal for the player, that being to reach the checkpoint. The only real risk of dying here is by sliding too far on this platform, by which point you've already hit the checkpoint anyway. Just to make sure it's as fair as possible, I even shifted down the checkpoint just a couple of pixels so you don't slide under it. You're welcome. From this point, ideally the player would see the green arrows pointing towards the exit door. Making your way there uses purely mechanics that have already been taught, just in a bit of a more difficult way. I had to make a lot of invisible adjustments to make this room more forgiving, as I wanted this level to feel difficult both skill and puzzle wise, but I didn't want it to feel unfair. The mechanic is already finicky enough, and I didn't want to further make it feel that way through the level design. So when designing this room, I actually started with the exit. I knew I wanted to force the player to use a dash orb to get through, which I initially did with just a block, before realizing you could cheese it relatively easily. Still though, clicking one dash orb and switching mid-air didn't really feel like a good final challenge for the level. Something that a lot of really good puzzle designers do is to create a clear, linear path to the exit, then adding more elements to obscure that path and stop the player in their tracks. I wouldn't say that I did this perfectly in my level, but a good puzzle would have the player start off on a fairly obvious solution, before blocking the path with some form of paradox, like this puzzle in Portal for example. Upon entering the room, the exit is clearly visible across the room. In order to get there, you need to hop on this moving platform, which only starts moving when the energy pellet is redirected into this receptacle. This seems easy enough, right? You just place a portal here and oh, it doesn't line up. A clear path with a complication in the middle. Another reason you should go play Portal right now. The solution, by the way, is to bounce the pellet off the wall here to send it back through the orange portal, the connecting blue portal of which you place on the wall directly opposite the receptacle. Anyway, for this last dash orb in ShiftLeaf, I've decided that the complication would be offsetting the orb, forcing the player to switch mid-air to get pushed up by this block. Now, this is the first time the player gets pushed off course while dashing, but because I've already introduced the player to switching directions while using a dash orb, this becomes an intuitive thing for the player to do. See, if I just threw the player into this dash orb right after the second room, it would be a far more difficult puzzle, and putting it at the end of a big room like this would just feel bad and unfun. But because I introduced this tool to the player, it's a reasonable last challenge to put decently far after a checkpoint that, ideally, makes the player feel smart for figuring it out, and serves as a satisfying conclusion to the level. Probably the biggest complaint I received about the level is that it was too short, which, first of all, that's kind of a compliment, so thank you. But also, I do think that this dash orb is one of the main reasons why. Realistically, it's a pretty similar length to most of the other rated platformer levels at the moment, but because I spent so much time introducing everything to the player, along with the last dash orb being the most satisfying part, the level felt like it cut off right when it started to get good. That being said, I don't want to discount that criticism. The level may have actually just been short, and I do actually want to do a sequel where I focus a lot more on complex puzzles. Anyway, after this last dash orb, it was just a case of making the rest of the room. With having the exit on the far right, I wanted the player to be able to get there before the dash orb, forcing them to really think about the rest of the puzzle. Unfortunately though, this left a lot of the playtesters just sitting there feeling lost, not wanting to play the level anymore. What I probably could have done to prevent this is to focus a bit more on the puzzle elements earlier on in the level in order to prepare the player for how they'll need to think throughout the rest of it. In the context of puzzle games, the idea that it's a puzzle game is pretty obvious right off the bat. But puzzle levels aren't very common in Geometry Dash at all yet, so it's important to establish that pretty early on. I tried getting across that it's a puzzle level everywhere I promoted it, along with putting the word puzzle in the description, but it's important to recognize that a lot of people would just enter the level blindly, expecting a straightforward, linear platformer experience until you tell them otherwise. So I added a little text prompt. I didn't really want to, but you still have to work out the complication of the puzzle, so in my eyes, it's worth that small sacrifice if it means more people can complete and enjoy the level. Beyond that, I put a little mid-air dash orb switch in there, just to remind the player that you can do that, before chucking them into a precise spider orb click, and the final dash orb, of course. Now, it's important to remember that this is literally my first attempt at a puzzle level in GD. I tried my best, but of course it isn't a perfect level, and I tried to mention any areas for improvement throughout the video that I could. If anyone else is a puzzle game fan, or even a developer, and has some more insights on what makes a good puzzle and what could be improved with my puzzles, definitely let me know in the comments. Either way, I wanted to share everything that I know so far in hopes that more people will try to make puzzle levels. I think platformer mode has huge potential for this, and I'd absolutely love to see more proper, well-made puzzles in the game, so I'm definitely going to push for it as much as I can. But either way, that was how I made ShiftLeaf Temple. I really hope you enjoyed the video, please let me know what you thought, another scripted video. Don't do these super often. But yeah, I'm gonna end this one off here. Thank you so much for watching. Really hope you enjoyed. Huge thank you to all the members, as always, especially GD Gaming and Ivdu. Really appreciate it. And yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you later.